Alex, he's with Tropiq, used to be with Nordic for a while, and is the CEO of Tropiq now and managing basically everything, to be honest, and having the general responsibility for operations and marketing sales also. But he will do an intro to Ethiopia, presenting Nordic, like the way we're working in Nordic, but also explaining a little bit of Tropiq. So, yeah, cool. Enjoy.
All right, guys. So my name's Alex. The reason I'm presenting Ethiopia today is I've spent quite a lot of time there as well the past years. 3 years ago, I moved there and sort of spent the full year managing the office in Ethiopia, and then I've been sort of in and out. And it's been sort of four years of going in and out of Ethiopia. So obviously, I know a little bit of the history and sort of the differences and what's happened and why things are the way they are today. And that's what I'm going to try to present to you. So a little bit of how it started. I think this is sort of the only slide I kept.
That's fine.
But Nordic Approach, 2012. And obviously was founded to source coffee for any roaster that wanted to buy green coffee spot. And after that, 2014, Nordic Approach sort of had more presence in Ethiopia. We had sort of one guy on the ground because we did notice that it is complicated to do business in Ethiopia and to find the coffee and to actually ship the coffee that you buy. And eventually, Tropiq AS was founded in 2016 and Tropiq Ethiopia in 2017, just to separate that out from Nordic Approach, but also to have different, for accounting purposes and all these things also. In 2022, we're expanding to different origins, trying to replicate a bit the model that we have built in Ethiopia. So we're going to Uganda, we have in Colombia and expanding to Peru. And obviously, we buy most of the coffee, all of the coffee for Nordic Approach too, so all of the other origins are something that we deal with and that Joe buys from, but we don't necessarily have offices in all of them. So the only thing I'm going to say about Tropiq specifically today is that we have unique, transparent, sustainably and ethically sourced coffee for basically any roaster, any importer that wants to buy coffee from what we feel is some of the best producers and farmers out there. So our mission is to empower sort of farmers and roasters to connect through quality, as we do search for the best quality and we do source some what we think is some of the best quality, and we obviously want to connect both worlds. So this is thank you, James. But this is a map of Ethiopia, and I just wanted to show more or less sort of where the coffee belt is. I'm just going to assume that some of you don't really know so much about Ethiopia, so I'm going to go through a little bit of the production and the maps and all these things, as well as a little bit in depth. So in purple here is sort of where we source most of the coffee, but you can also see it's not necessarily where most of the coffee is produced. There are bigger sort of coffee areas in the west, but we focus right here. And I'm going to put a little bit of context to it. So going from Addis Ababa down to Awassa, which is sort of the biggest town before coming down to the coffee regions, that takes about half a day to get there by car. And then it takes another sort of 5 to 6 hours to reach the first sort of coffee regions. And if you really want to go down to Guji, it takes 1 to maybe almost 2 full days to actually get to the first farm in Guji. So that puts a little bit of perspective. This is the 6th largest landlocked country in the world, and it's populated by 110 million people. Now I think it's 120. So it's also one of the most densely populated countries in Africa. I think after Nigeria, it's the 2nd largest population in Africa. And just a fun fact, there's just about 1 million cars in total in all of Ethiopia, and there's 120 million people. So the primary mode of transportation is not car, obviously. It's like either you walk or you take a donkey or a horse or whatever. And that's how coffee is transported, and that's how everything else is transported in Ethiopia. So again, to put it a bit in perspective, when you want to be buying a coffee from the coffee regions and you sort of send a contract and the coffee is still down there, it takes between 5 to 10 days to actually reach Addis Ababa. And the reason for that is like trucks are not really made for high altitude, and they break down all the time, and spare parts are non-existent. So just that takes a long time, and obviously it needs to be milled in Addis, and then it needs to be shipped to Djibouti, which is the only place where you can export from Ethiopia. And Djibouti is where the port is. So this would take 10 days, and obviously there's a lot of things happening in Addis, but this road also takes 4 to 5 days, more or less. So that's sort of coffee. Some of you have known, there's a war going on in Ethiopia, and there's a lot of ethnic battles and things like that. And that has been happening towards the north. So it doesn't really affect here, but because there's about 70 ethnicities and about 60 different languages, and each of them don't really understand each other, then obviously there's always some sort of ethnic clash, and that happens all over Ethiopia. So whenever we say like we can't move it now because there's some ethnic or something happening in Ethiopia, then that's mainly the reason. We never know where it's going to happen or what's going to happen. We just deal with it every day. Obviously, like you can raise your hand if you have specific questions, but I'm going to try to run through the slides, and then we can sort of have a Q&A in the end. So a little bit of backstory of Ethiopia. The old model is sort of the first model that you see up here. Farmers would go to a collection point. I will explain what that is. That would then go to a washing station. So most of the wash coffees, all of the wash coffees we have are sort of from a washing station. And then from there, you would always go through something called an ECX checkpoint. And ECX is the Ethiopian Commodity Exchange, which is sort of a government-run auction system for all of coffee in Ethiopia. And from there, it would go to a warehouse, be auctioned off, and exported from the person that bought the coffee. And this is the primary reason for all of you knowing what Sidamo is, Gucci, Yirgacheffe, all these like names, famous names from Ethiopia, is because the auction wouldn't let you know what farm it comes from, or like, who produced it, or exactly the location of the coffee. They would only let you know this coffee comes from Yirgacheffe. And so that's why, like, for a long time, that was the only traceability you had in Ethiopia. In 17, coffee was privatized or liberalized so that basically farmers no longer needed to go through the ECX and the warehouse. Farmers could go almost directly to export. So each farmer could, if they want to, have an export license, produce their own coffee, say, Alex, I want to sell it to Norway or Belgium or wherever, and they would be like, cool, I have an export license, there you go, Or they could sell it to a washing station that would then continue selling it privately. Without going through the ECX, like a government-run office, basically. The downside with liberalizing coffee is that obviously people want to take advantage of the system, and so for a couple of years, exporters basically sold coffee at a loss. I know it doesn't really make any sense that you would want to sell at a loss, but because Ethiopia is a closed economy, which means that they import from very few countries, like China mainly, but they import from few countries, and they produce most of the things that they need in the country, then obviously they need to have as much dollars as possible. So selling it at a loss, meaning the exporter just wants to capture a lot of dollar to be able to import other goods and sell them locally, because that would be a more viable business for them. So in 2019, to my surprise, in Ethiopia, we started getting minimum export price and it was set by the government, and it changed daily, and it could fluctuate from literally 25% to almost doubling in price within one day. So some days a coffee would be $2 a pound, some days it would be $4, some days $5.50, who knows? And so it was really like fluctuating, and there's not really any logic to that, unfortunately. So fortunately now, the price fluctuates weekly instead of daily, which is a bit better for us, and it doesn't fluctuate too much either. But there's still no logic in why it would be 20 cents higher or 10 cents lower, because it doesn't follow the world market. So that's the Nordic supply chain, more or less. The farmer could go then directly and export, or the private washing station can also directly export their coffee. They can pass the ECX, any government-run office, and basically we would be sourcing it, and then Nordic would be importing it into Belgium to have a spot position. They buy from cooperatives, private stations, but also single farmers, and I'm going to show a couple of examples of that. So this is typically, there's a few pictures coming. This is typically this is a single farmer. This is Balesi Tingu. He's in Adado. It's just south of Dilla, which is one of the larger cities in the coffee regions. And he has a few workers, and he has, I think last time I checked, like 30 plus tables, drying tables, and he's invested in all of it himself. So any money that he's able to capture from selling cherry or selling parchment directly to us or to others before us, he would reinvest, and he would rebuild very nice stations, and you would buy tanks to float cherries and all these things. So we can, by Ethiopian law now, since 2019, buy directly from single farmers, which before that we could not. And this year, happily, we're buying all of his volume, so that's this is an example of a washing station. Obviously, it's very different from any other, country. It's larger productions. This specific one, I think, has 100 and something tables. It doesn't look like it here, but it is made up of some partitions, and it is equivalent to a bit more than 100 tables. So the collection point that I mentioned earlier, farmers would basically come in from the main gate, and then the collection point would be just at the entry of the hopper, basically, where you put all the cherries in. Here you can very visually see the fermentation tanks, and here the floating tanks. Yeah, that's better. Here are the floating tanks, and then all the mucilage and everything, it would basically go down here to a ditch, and then they have some like stones, charcoal, like different things to try to filter and neutralize the acidity of the water, but that is here. Obviously, it's like not always so optimal. So our job as Tropiq, but also like our job for checking quality and all these things, is really looking at the structure of the station to see that there's not that like the spill water is not going to go into the drying area, or that it's well structured and also relatively well filtered. We aren't talking about Ethiopia when I say it takes 10 days to go down there, so you're not going to bring a huge water filtration machine there. But yes, that's part of the quality that we do. This is how wild it can be. So this is a Danshe. Nordic buys actually quite a lot of volume from them. So Danshe is at around 2,000 meters above sea level, but they are getting coffee from like the surrounding regions, the surrounding area, and the top here would be 350 to 400, something like that, meters above sea level. So there's a wide difference between the harvest, where down here you would have maybe more ripe cherry in, let's say, November, December, and here you would have more ripe cherry in January, February. But it's quite beautiful, and they have 300 and something tables, like 350 tables, I think, this year. And it was all built literally 2 years ago. So all of what you see is built in, it was built almost the same year, but they've made some improvements, but it's built in 2 years. So this is a private station. So we covered a single farmer, private station, and a co-op looks the same. It's just that in a co-op, basically the farmers are part owners, so they also decide the price together with sort of the board and everything. So that's the main difference. After that, for those that don't know and haven't seen sort of how the process is in Ethiopia, it resembles Kenya, so it goes through this pulper. Here as well, I just want to emphasize, like, part of our job is to really look at quality and to look at the materials that are being used. So we look at water quality, and we look at sort of obviously cherry maturation, how they sort, how they float, and all these things. But we also look at details like how is it calibrated. The calibration is basically these two discs need to be at one perfect position for it to not break the beam, but also take off the mucilage. So it's sort of like, it's not always well done, and so we always do that, as well as look at the teeth. I call it the teeth, but the teeth of the disc. If they're really run down, it's gonna lower the quality of the beam. If they are sharp, like these ones are, then you have like a clean cut of the mucilage and of the cherry, and it's going to ferment well. It goes into tanks. Obviously, this is a special case. Tanks don't look like this mainly in Ethiopia. There's a few places that do, so I wanted to show you the best one. but these are tiles, and you don't really have tiles in Ethiopia. And also, like, buying tiles in Addis is also not really. It's for home use. So this specific one, they have a business in Dubai, so they're able to actually import tiles for their fermentation tanks, and so they're implementing that. And I think it's super good to be working with people that sort of always think innovatively.
Where is this, Alex?
This is Uragararo. Yeah. After that, everything is taken out into channels, and this is basically how they wash the coffee. So they remove the last pieces of mucilage, and all those like sugars and all those, all that slimy thing basically that's left in the tank. So it is water intensive, and there's no way of actually. There are ways, but in Ethiopia, because it's a closed economy, and you can't import whatever you want without the government saying yes or no. This is what they've done, and it's very water intensive, so it's not always great, but everyone does it their own way. So some use less water, some wash it differently, some soak it differently, and that's always like the details that we look for. Just to show you, I don't have a picture of a soaking tank, but after fermentation and washing, it goes into the soaking tank. And because in Ethiopia, they get between 50 and 100,000 kilos of cherry a day, they don't spend so much time in the soaking tanks. There's not capacity for it. So it's literally just a place where water runs off, and sometimes they can soak, but mostly it's to make the water run off from the fermentation, and just the last clean, basically. It then goes onto drying beds, and like I said, drying beds, there can be hundreds of drying beds. And the complexity in Ethiopia is to prioritize how much natural you produce, how much wash you produce, and do you experiment at all or not, because all of it will always impact the capacity of the region. So it's really prioritizing wash in the beginning of the season, because you have like so much cherry and coffee coming in. I don't know if 100 tons of cherry, like if you can visualize it, but 100 tons of cherry is a lot. One table is maybe equivalent to it's hard to say because it depends. Like some people, they would put like this is just in the morning where they're opening it up, but they would spread it out, and it's sort of a micro layer of coffee. It's less than one single layer, almost, you know. And some will actually pack it up because they don't have capacity. So that's also something that we look at. But it fluctuates. Sometimes it's 10 bags of green coffee per table. Sometimes it's 20, 30, depending on the layer that they have on each table. But that's how little it is. So they dry it in about 11, 12 days, and every 12 days they need to rotate. And so obviously the capacity, you know, when you're at peak harvest and you get 100 tons of cherry, that layer is going to get bigger. Yeah. So this is just, that's the only photo I have actually of the experiments at the moment. But these are some of the anaerobic tanks that we use with one of our partners. And basically he's been fermenting and done experimenting for the past like 4 or 5, actually more than 6 years. So he has sort of a specific way in these specific tanks that he buys from a specific person. And so he likes to sort of use those. But it is possible then to produce experiments in Ethiopia. And they don't do like 1 bag or 2 bags. They try to produce at scale. Because that's the only way for them to be viable, for it to be viable. Yeah. These are naturals. Just to show you the difference between sort of washed and natural and how it's dried. So, I mean, they rotate and they try to rotate the drying of cherry every day, all the time. So this year, obviously if it gets too lengthy, just like, Alex, you're talking too much. But it's, this year, so historically rainy season always like stops around September. And then there's occasional like tropical rains, so actually heavy rainfall. And that heavy rainfall helps for cherry maturation. So you need some rain, and some sun and some heat, and then you need sort of like heavy rainfalls for the cherry to do the final step of maturing. And this year, everybody thought like this is going to be the biggest year ever. We're all going to do so well. And rain stopped in September. That's fine. But basically, there was no more rain coming after that. So like occasional small rainfalls, but not enough for cherry to mature. So at some point, like in November, people were like, oh no, we're not going to have enough coffee to produce this year. We're not going to be able to fulfill all of our contracts. So they all said like, it's going to be 30 to 40% lower than what we expected. And that day, prices just skyrocketed. And some of the low yields is basically the reason for that price increase. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors, but the fact that they thought harvest is going to be lower didn't really help. The West is a bit different. So I'm mainly speaking about our coffee belt, sort of where we buy most of our coffee. In the West, there's more lowlands. It's a bit lower altitudes where there is sort of more rain and sun and all these things. So production there was all-time high. Production in our regions, like Uji, Sidamo, Escarsi, Jägershev, all these places, was not. So it is the farmer's year this year. I mean, basically farmers received much more for their coffee than what they ever did before. Even with inflation, and even with the currency fluctuations, they received 2 to 3 times more than what they did last year for cherry. So all the farmers were like, and it's great. The only thing is then, and I will go a bit more into depth in that after, but basically every station fights or competes to get cherry. And so one station will be, I offer people 60. And the next station will be like, I don't have enough cherry, I'll offer you 62. And the farmer will just walk to the one that offers the most, obviously. And so that's how sort of the Ethiopia model isn't great, because whoever has the most cash can be like, you know, I'll give you whatever. And farmers will come to him, and then others are desperate. And yeah. So farmers are definitely trading, and farmers are also deciding on how much they want in terms of money for their coffee. And if they don't get enough, then they just keep it. Yeah.
Yeah. Do these like higher prices correlate mostly to higher cost of production, or are they actually earning more than they used to do?
Cost of production for a farmer is almost zero in the sense that they don't buy fertilizer.
Okay, yeah.
There's nothing there. They prune, and it depends on their yield. So it's a farmer's yield, but other than that, for the farmer, the cost of production is almost zero. If what they do is only deliver care.
Okay.
But if a farmer dries their own coffee and creates their own natural loss, like Valesi, Dingu, and all these single farmers that Nordic buys, then obviously there's a much higher cost of production, and that's why we're seeing an exponential increase in price, also because we want it to be financially viable for them, obviously. But to your point, cost of production is much higher, and so that's why many station and washing stations, out of the 2,000 that exist in Ethiopia, did not open this year because it's just too expensive. Can't make it. So on Tropiq's website, I created a small sort of conversion calculator, and it's based on Ferrosula. Ferrosula is 17 kilos of parchment, and that's how coffee is traded in Ethiopia. It's traded in 17 kilos, 17 kilo parchment. So price, estimated cost for 17 kilos of parchment is around 5,200 bid. And if you put in the US dollar conversion from US dollars, so $1 is 50 bid, then this is more or less the price that the exporter needs to get to cover the cost and to get a small margin. So obviously you can look at historical data, and we can look at the highest price, which I saw was 11,000 bid per suva, and yeah, you can basically calculate the price. Yeah.
Is that for any quality that goes through a washing station?
This is for grade 1.
For grade 1.
Yeah, this is grade 1. Sorry. So there's more info under the calculator, but this is for grade 1. So obviously I can go through what Tropiq does, and it's like this is only from samples. It has nothing to do with what's before the sample. So, we can talk about how many weeks it will take to get a coffee out of the country. That will be another hour and a half talking to you guys. So I'm gonna skip that very fast. And so, we have a presence for a reason, obviously, and it's for Nordic Approach, and it's also for Tropiq. So obviously maintaining all the relationships. But as you can see, we're not dealing with, one bag of coffee and whatever. We're dealing with warehouses that have thousands and rows and rows of mountains of coffee. And we need to keep traceability, but we also need to make sure that we have the quality that we want, and that we export what we're actually buying. And so yeah, that's some pointers, but in essence, that's why we are there. So what's up with the future of Ethiopia? What will impact, for sure, coffee in Ethiopia is the fact that exporters are buying stations now instead of only having vertically integrated stations. I'm not sure I'm going to go too much into depth into vertical integration versus owning one, but the vertical integration is an exporter makes a deal with a farmer saying, I want to buy your coffee at X price and X amount of volume. And so it's up to the farmer to actually manage the economy of producing that coffee. As to if they buy the station, they can manage the whole supply chain, and so that's why they're doing that now. But that will also change a little bit the cost and the pricing in Ethiopia. Ethiopia definitely needs US dollars. They've been taking up loans and one after the other, especially with China, and now they're noticing that they don't have enough dollars in the country. So they're starting to, that's not, maybe they're listening, but they're starting to default on some loans and things like that. So that's why we're seeing more laws and rules around what you can keep as US dollars, but also how coffee and commodities are traded in Ethiopia. That will have an impact on exporters, how many actually want to be staying in business because it's financially viable. Um, and many are closing down shop and going to something else because coffee is not as attractive in terms of dollars anymore. An exporter can only keep 20%. That doesn't really make sense, but basically 70% of the dollar that comes into the country is given, the currency itself is given to the government, and then they get the local currency back. 10% banks keep, and 20% is what the exporter keep. It used to be the exporter gets 60 to 70%, 2 years ago. So that changes the economy a lot, and that reduces the exporter's wish to do a lot of coffee business, unless that's the only business that they do. You cannot sell at a loss anymore because of minimum export price. And government now knows that we are making some funky coffees here and there, and they're putting minimum export price on that too. And now it's $10 a pound. It used to be 3 last year, so 3 to 4 to 5. I mean, it depends on the qualities, obviously, but the ones that were selling at a loss were selling at 3.54, selling at a loss, and others obviously higher, but now it's 10.
Alex, I have a question.
Yo,
How the government knows when you make different?
fermentations and stuff.
Yeah.
Historically, there's ECX, and so historically they think we know what everything should taste like. So wash yogurt is a wash yogurt, and if it's not floral and if it starts having acidic, aromas and all these things, they will be like, you made an experiment. And then you need to fight and be like, no. But yes, that's literally like the government decides now which one is or is not based on profile. Yeah. So I mean more data, but basically C-market 100% inflation. I just got data 2 weeks ago that it went from 25% to now 50%. So the latest inflation data is 50% in Ethiopia. So that means that the currency obviously is going to spiral down, and you come to a point where you can't get over that edge. So it means that bid is just going to continue going up, the number. And so obviously that will also change the economy, I think. Share price increased by 100%. Obviously all the overhead costs. There's almost no fuel left in Ethiopia because of the war, and that also nobody knows what will happen, but maybe they don't have enough fuel next year. So yeah, that's something. And labor shortage as well. It's better for a farmer now to farm coffee and to pick cherries and to deliver it and then do nothing the whole day. If they choose to, then to go to a station and actually just sort, because their daily salary there will be much less than just getting a small bag of coffee and selling it. So basically there's less incentives for them to actually go to a washing station and work, and that is also going to change, I think, the dynamic of the So that's how it looks, the Ethiopian bid. And for sure it's just going to continue going up. I mean, I don't see that going down anytime soon. That's one of more concerns. But basically, this is to show you a bit the impact on price for Nordic Approach, and to summarize a little bit the impact on price in general. But yeah, where you last year could get coffee between $10 to $7 on FOB price per kilo, this year is between 9 and 12. And who knows where it's going to go in the future, but everything we talked about has an impact on those prices. Yep.
Just can you say something about grade 2 and grade 3?
Yeah. Yes. There's a grading system in Ethiopia for coffee. So when you see grade 1, it is what the government and also the exporters see as the best coffee in Ethiopia. So if it scores above 87, 88, This is Ethiopian scores. So for us, it would be maybe an 86, maybe lower, 85, 86. For them, it's a great one. And basically, it's the most dense beans. It's the cleanest that come out of the washing stations, and it's what has sort of the highest flavor profile, like the most intense flavor profile of the specific region that it's supposed to be from. And a grade 2 is just a little more defects, or a little, not defects, less intensity, basically. It's based on cup profile and intensity. So grade 2 would be that, and a grade 3 would be just more defects and lower quality. And there's a difference between washed and naturals. So washed will always be grade 1, and naturals didn't used to exist as a grade 1. It does now, because you get profiles that are very clean and intense. But yeah, it's a grading system, and the prices are decided by grade as well.
What means a lot in Ethiopia? When we're talking about a lot, what it means? One day of harvest,
That's complicated, because it really depends on who produces the coffee. I would say one lot should be 1 day lot, but a day lot can also be separated into 2 lots, because if you have 100 tables of 1 day lot, you're not going to be all of this is 1 lot. So partly the production by day or by 2 days, and partly by trucks that they bring into this action. So if you have 1 day and you have 700 bags, they're not going to say 700 bags is lot 1. They're going to say 300 lot 1, 400 lot 2, more or less. So it's separated a bit like that. It's super different from any other place, but they just produce so much more volume. So it's kind of, it's, that's it. So, please.
Another question about the grade 2 and grade 3.
Yeah.
Like, based on those being at lower prices, and based on the cherry lower selling prices, export prices, but the cherry prices being so high,
Yeah.
is it possible to profitably produce grade 2 and grade 3 coffee in Ethiopia this year? Or have you seen some change in that?
Yeah, huge change. So the cherry cost, is super high, and they will try to optimize for producing great ones. And basically, because it boils down to flavor profiles and stuff, now they will be a bit more, maybe they will look at the grade 1 and they'll be like, well, this is still acceptable as a grade 1, and they will try to optimize basically their selection of grade 1s. As to for grade 2, obviously some people are selling at a loss, but the way it works is that they're going to try to increase their margin on grade 1s to make up for the loss on the grade 2. That's basically how they balance it off. So sometimes the price doesn't really make sense for a grade 1, but it depends on how they manage their own business. Very often it's like this.
So I've heard there's less grade 2 in the market this year.
Much less grade 2, partly because they're trying to select things as good as possible, and they are focusing on quality because the yields were so low, so they can't afford to make too much volume coffee. So there's just much less grade 2 available for sure. And if there are any, it's kind of what I would consider lower, commercial grade coffee almost, because it's not good. Last year some are super good, obviously, with our partners as well. Like, we make sure that the grade 1s are true grade 1s and grade 2s are true grade 2s. But if you go out in the market and you just fly in and be like, I just want to taste some stuff, then you're going to taste grade 1s that are good and grade 2s that are pretty shit. So, again, a reason for being present in Ethiopia and making sure that we get what we want.
I'm just wondering, how would you keep consistency of flavor from, say, you have a farmer coming in and they sell something to a washing station, and the next bit comes in, if they have different flavor, or would they have different flavors from the different farms, and then are they then being mixed together, and are they mixed together evenly? How does that work?
You mean in terms of washing station, getting 700 farmers into a washing station? It's all mixed.
It's all mixed.
Yeah. So what you'll get is basically more of a regional profile and less of a typical one farmer, one coffee, one profile type of coffee. So like in the Danche pictures, for example, you would differentiate from like the super high altitude ones because they are just later harvest, which are more intense in a different way. And then the earlier harvest, that's still amazing, but it's just a little bit different. And all farmers so you can differentiate out if you one day know of a farmer that has more than like 10 hectares, let's say, because then it's viable. Like then you can produce enough to export from one farmer. But the farmer that has 1 to 2 hectares in Ethiopia, like nobody is gonna want to export that separately. I mean, not nobody, but very few people, because it's just too difficult to process.
Did you have much control over that end, or is that up to that?
We would have control over that end too. So if we together go into the field and there's a couple of them that we visit and we're like, wow, 10 hectares, beautiful, getting help from neighbors, so increasing the total hectarage. We could be like, we want this to be separated out, and then they will dedicate 2-3 drying tables for us, and then we can be like, cool, let's just buy his coffee, all the totality of the volume from him, and just make it as good as possible. We can, but then it also needs to be a good harvest, and it needs to be financially viable for everyone.
Can you talk a little bit about milling? You sort of said that everything is done on big scale. There's a
Yeah.
lot of people, when you're thinking Central or South America,
Oh,
thinking
yeah.
20 bag lots. So
Oh, I wish I had a picture of that.
can you talk about milling 20 bag lots in Ethiopia?
You can't.
Yeah, thank you.
No, so a 20 bag lot, basically you put it through the machine, and it's kind of like the Brazilian machines. It's you put it through and it disappears. I mean, on the other side you get 2 bags. So yields, I mean, I'm exaggerating for people that know what I'm talking about, but like you get very little out on the other end, and the machine basically just takes most of the volume because they consider it all as either low density or whatever. So you have to process like 100 bags of parchment, maybe 200 bags of parchment for it to make sense, actually. And so that's why on the offer list of Nordic, you will see 100 bag lots, and it's not because we don't want to go smaller, it's because unless we have a dry mill that's small enough to do that, which almost doesn't exist, then we just can't, because the coffee disappears and the exporter is like, yeah.
But how do you do with the small lots?
So the very small ones, like obviously you can find some dry mills that have like a huge dry mill, and then they have a tiny one on the side that they started off with 10 years ago. And often like we work with that to process some of the smaller lots that we have. So any experiments that are very hard to process, we process on smaller machines, basically. And the same for like the single farmers, it's like very small machines, because the big ones just absorb it all. I mean, we also have to think about the capacity of a dry mill. It starts off with like 2-3 days in February or so, like to start milling, but then it mills 24/7 every day for months. So, it starts at 6 and it just continues. And if the dry mill or the generator, because it's petrol-based, needs a break because it's too hot, they will stop 1 hour and then they will continue again. And it's 24/7. So when we're like, can you please reprocess? They're like, like 500 bags here, 400 bags there, and you want to reprocess 50? Cool. Because they have to basically stop it, clean it, so push through like a lot of air for all the commercial grades and stuff not to be mixed with our quality coffee, and then process ours, and then re-clean it, and then continue processing the others. So reprocessing or like changing contracts, all these things, that's the overview with the 1 week delay stuff. That's how it is to deal in Ethiopia. It's
Can you go back to that slide, Alex? Just can you go through it real briefly?
Yeah, so this is also, that's including sort of like the client communication, sort of making decisions, like it's all that long process of sending an offer sample, waiting for DHL to actually arrive and pick it up, that can take 5 days, who knows, like DHL to deliver it, for them to come with feedback, and imagine like if a client after 15 days are like, well, we didn't like any, but we still want to buy from you. That's another 15 days. So that's like actually knowing every client and knowing their preference and being able to like send exactly what we think they should be buying this year is like also one of the huge benefits of us being there. Not only can we be more efficient, but also the client get their coffee this time. Shipping this year is hard, so let's not talk about that. But everything else before that is while we're there also. So I mean, I made this like almost, I guess 3 years ago. It's still valid, but obviously there are some parts where we're way more efficient now than we've ever been before. But these are realities that do exist and that a lot of people actually go through when they're buying from origin, especially Ethiopia.
If you contrast it with what John presented about how Kenya works yesterday, Kenya starts to look like
I wasn't there, sorry.
Amazon. Like basically you're getting a sample and it's done, and they'll send it to you right away.
Super well organized.
Yeah.
So well organized.
The comparison is just very interesting.
It's night and day.
Yeah, because there's so many details and so many like little things that do not go by themselves. Let's say.
No, so like in Kenya, obviously you have these, like bigger companies, but that know how to run a company and that wants to make it as efficient as possible. As to in Ethiopia, I'm running a coffee business and I'm trying my best, but I don't want any help from anyone. And it's it's a bit that pride and a bit all of these things, and so you don't end up being so efficient in the end.
And I mean, I think sorry.
No, please.
Like two of the other main differences are that like the production volumes in Kenya are drastically smaller than those of Ethiopia, as well as the fact that Kenya has been open to investment from like international organizations and Ethiopia.
Yeah. So obviously, like we hope that one day Ethiopia will open up, but they will not open up to trade. So you will not be able, like telecommunications, fine. But the trade is their commodity is what they live off of, so they wouldn't want any international company to actually hold a trading license, because then they know that the same as before will happen. Those companies will take the dollars and keep it outside of the country instead of bringing it in. So that's why it's sort of a hard sort of.
But that's a very short-sighted way of looking at it, because all of the investment that they would make in terms of building infrastructure and skill sets into Ethiopia would be also what they leave behind.
For sure.
So it's like when you go to Kenya versus when you go to Angola, both were colonized by very different countries. And so what's left behind by those countries, even though that colonization was not a good thing, they left behind very different things. And so, yes, okay, you can talk about money and what we take out as like international companies, or also what we take out as individuals, like thinking only for ourselves. But I think the bigger thing is also what do we leave behind in terms of infrastructure investment and skill sets within a country, because that's what's severely lacking in Ethiopia.
For sure. So one would hope that the Prime Minister one day sort of sees that, but
That's not
I
going.
don't know the future. Yeah.
Can you talk about organic certifications?
Yeah.
Regarding what you said earlier, that most of the farmers don't use any chemicals there.
Yeah.
What's the deal with certification? Why some have it and some don't?
So, since liberalization of coffee in Ethiopia, there's been more of a trend for exporters, like large companies, to go through the auditing process of the washing stations that they own. But the auditing process takes 1.5 years. It depends on the certifying body, and it costs $5,000. But $5,000 x any other cost, like improvements, if they have to repair some things to pass, like the auditors, all of their expenses need to be paid, like all these things. So it's a heavy cost. So unless you are an exporter and have a lot of capital free to be going through that process, and you want that because you have customers wanting that, you're not going to go through it. We had most of you know, we had an exporter, like a small family business, that had 3 washing stations, and they did certify the first year, but basically the auditing process makes you pay so many different fees that in the end, the small profit that they ended up having versus the request that they were getting, which was not huge, wasn't really worth it for them. So they just said like, well, you can see on our farm we're not doing anything, and we don't have stock of any fertilizer or any chemicals whatsoever, because there's no need for that. So why should we pay an additional fee just to get a piece of paper that says it's organic?
Because for them it's a little more money if they sell it as organic.
Huge, yeah, $5,000 plus, let's say $10,000 for some smaller businesses that are trying to grow, but also like have family members and all these to support. Like $10,000 is insane.
That's the cost.
The cost,
That's just
yeah.
the cost,
But
yeah.
what they get, like you said, that's a lot more money.
Yeah,
When you
and
pay
but that's the
sales
thing.
tax.
Like some people will now just be like, "Oh, organic, give me this coffee with organic certification," and I don't want to pay extra for it. I just want it at the same price.
Mm.
And that's like sometimes it's non-negotiable because you're buying 20 containers. I'm not going to negotiate with you. Like if you're going to buy 20 containers and I don't have other clients, then obviously I'm going to try to sell it to you. And $1 a pound is a lot of money in the end if you're selling 10, 20 containers, for sure. So that's sort of the additional cost too, right? Like $10,000 is only for the piece of paper and the certification, but the additional costs, I think, were being thrown out of this presentation. Is much bigger.
Sorry, one more question
Yes.
about the organic certificates.
Yeah.
Is that something that you guys really pay attention to and you look at that as a good thing? Because I'm sure a lot of people agree, we don't really, I don't know, us, I know we see it more in some ways as a negative.
Yeah.
You've got the organic stamp on the
Yeah.
positive.
I think it depends on the client and the size of the roaster, but also like who the roaster sells to. I mean, some roasters that are now selling to supermarkets or are now trying to grow their business into like making coffee more available to people,
Yeah, I was thinking more
require
as,
organic
importers.
certification. Huh?
I'm thinking more importers and exporters. rather
As
than
importers, I don't think it matters too much to us. I don't know, Joe, if you have
I mean, I think in principle it matters, yes, right? Because the idea of organic is what are we putting out into the environment in the process of producing coffee and what impact is that having? So the principle, yes, it matters a lot. The practicalities of actually being organically certified, being accessible to most producers is problematic for us because it's not really that accessible. So I wish that side of it could be worked on a bit more. And then in terms of its importance to us in a more practical way, it's more related to what our clients' needs are as to whether we want the certification or not. So the practices, yes, very important in theory and in practice. The certification, more important whether it's something our clients need or not, is what I would say. Alec can also add to that.
Would I mean the single farmers that you like Bolesi Dingu, organic certification would be completely out of the question for him, right?
completely.
But would you say that his production is organic?
Yeah, I mean,
So
they can't even afford buying fertilizer, so it's kind of there's no point in it. So what they try to do is optimize sort of how they grow coffee, which is planting indigenous trees and trying to create sort of the circular.
because for fertilizer is not accessible and not both you can't get it and you don't have the money for it. But would you say then, on a very practical level, thinking about the Nordic populace, about half of our Ethiopians would be organic certified and half not? But would you say that all of them would probably be produced?
All of them.
Or,
Yeah.
that's kind of what we've said there. Almost all Ethiopian coffees we buy are organic by default.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between organic production
Yeah.
and organic certification.
Yeah.
That's kind of the
Definitely.
conversation we're having now.
Absolutely.
So we understand that the sticker is important for a lot of people, for a lot of customers, you know, all of that stuff. But when we're talking about Ethiopia, like fertilization, not as far as I've seen, like doesn't really.
Doesn't, except if you have sort of lowlands coffee, like 1,000 meters above sea level in some and some places, or like in the west where there is a bit more lowlands, where it's like you have to accelerate the growth of the tree. All of it is okay, for sure.
No pest control for disease?
No. There's like small signs here and there, but it just disappears. I mean, it doesn't take over. So the only thing I've seen is low day frost, which you see everywhere, or like that fungus that makes the tree go black. Some places you can see that, but it's very rare. Thank you. I think Espen wants you to cut now.
Thank you.